Good morning, Algebra 2 students. Excuse me. Good morning, Algebra 2 students. Today we're going to be solving quadratics by completing the square. So just remember that we've been solving quadratics by graphing and trying to find where it crosses the x-axis or the x-intercepts. And then we solve some quadratics by factoring. And this is just another method of solving quadratics. We're doing the same thing. We're finding out what makes it equal 0, where does the graph cross the x-axis. But we're going to be doing this by a method called completing the square. Now, you can always use this method, but we are only going to use this method when a equals 1 and when b is even. Why? Because it's much easier when that's the case. And this is a method you're not going to use a lot, but it is pretty easy when a is 1 and b is even. All right, so first of all, today we're just going to talk about what does it mean to complete the square. And what we're going to do basically is we're going to make PSTs, which are perfect square trinomials that factor very easily. Okay, so for example, if I have x squared plus 8x, and I want to make this a perfect square trinomial, what we're going to do is we're going to take, and you can see in this case that a is 1 and b is even, but we're going to take half of b, which is 4, and then square it, which gives us 16. So by making these PXT, or perfect square trinomials, half of b squared will be the c value. And then you can see that if we would factor this, we'd have x and x, 4 and 4, and both signs would be positive. And since I have x plus 4 times x plus 4, I could write this as x plus 4 squared. Now, a relationship that you're going to see in all these is that you're going to have half of 8, which is 4, and then 4 squared is 16. And we'll talk about that a little bit later today. So this next one, we have x squared minus 12x plus what? So if I take half of b, which is negative 6, square it, I get 36. And then how would this factor? X and x. Both signs are negative, 6 and 6. And you can see if I check this, negative 6x and negative 6x is negative 12x. And I could write it as x minus 6 squared. Next example, half of 20 is 10. And I'm going to do it this way. So if that's the case, I should know that this is going to factor to be x plus 10 squared. And then 10 squared is 100. So that's a different way of doing this, kind of showing less work, but very acceptable. And in the same fashion in this one, half of negative 14 is negative 7. So it'd be x minus 7 squared. And then this is 49, half of b squared. All right, so how does this help us? So when we're solving a quadratic by completing the square, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this c value. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides. I'm going to leave a space there because I'm going to complete that square. To complete this, again, half of b is negative 4, squared is 16. What you add to one side, you must add to the other. And now on the left side, factoring this would be x minus 4 squared equals 23. I'm going to run out of space here, but we're going to take the square root of both sides. So I have x minus 3. And remember, when we do that, we get the positive and negative square root of 23. So what I'm doing is taking the square root of both sides there. Then if I add 4 to get x, I would have x equals 4 plus or minus the root of 23. Now those solutions, if you could simplify the root of 23, you should, breaking it down. But you could also put those in your calculator and get the decimal values for that. All right, so this next one, first thing I would do is subtract 3 from both sides, leave a space, and now I realize that this is going to factor to be x minus 2 squared, which means that's got to be a positive 4. And what I add to one side, I must add to the other. So that equals 1. Now if I take the square root of both sides, I'd have just x minus 2 equals the positive and negative square root of 1. I could then add 2, and I'd have 2 plus or minus the square root of 1. Now in this case, you can see that I know what the square root of 1 is. So this is 2 plus 1, which is 3, and 2 minus 1, which is 1. And those would be my two solutions. You could factor this one, and you would get those same solutions there. Next example, I'm going to add 9 to both sides, leaving a space. This is going to be half of b squared is 36, so I add that to both sides. So now this would factor to be x plus 6 squared. Remember that comes from half of b is 45. Take the square root of both sides. It gives me positive and negative root of 45. And then I would add or subtract 6 to get negative 6 plus or minus the root of 45. Now, in this case, I don't know what the square root of 45 is exactly, but I could simplify that as root 9 root 5, which turns to be 3 root 5. And those would be my two solutions, which again we could do on our calculator. We get some decimal values, or we could just leave it like that as long as it's simplified. This last example, I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. I'm now going to complete this square, so I'm going to need half of b squared, which is 9. I'm going to add that to one side, to the other. So this side's going to be x plus 3 squared, because that's a perfect square trinomial now. Negative 10 plus 9 is a negative 1. If I square root both sides, and then I subtract 3, I get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 1, which I can hear you right now saying that's I. So it's negative 3 plus or minus I would be your two solutions. So those are non-real. This is a parabola that would not cross the x-axis. All right, hope you understand this. It's kind of a easy method of solving quadratics if a is 1 and b is even. The whole key to this is understanding this principle of completing a square. This comes from half of b squared. This number is always half of b. And we're creating perfect squares, trinomials. All right, have a wonderful day. Complete that assignment in Google Classroom and submit.